So sure, I'll just dive into it. Can I share my screen? Let's see.
Okay, go for it.
All right.
Welcome, Christy.
Okay, can you all see my screen? Okay, great. So to give a little bit of context, maybe I'll just quickly show a couple of images to get you an idea. So the last, in October and November, November, December of last year, I had a show at Galerie Luis de Jesus, and I made an installation that combined paintings and a physical installation and also a questionnaire. And the questionnaire is something that I've used in the past as kind of a way to address some of the issues that are addressed in the paintings, but in a much more direct way. And also as a way to like sort of engage in a more like active dialogue with the audience. So I'll just go quickly through a couple of photos. There are paintings, I'm not gonna stop on them, but some of them have like specific kind of information-based content linked to economic systems or social and political content. And I don't want to stop there now because we don't have a million hours to spend. But I want to get to the part where you will see where the questionnaire was at. So when you went around that structure, at some point, there was this seating area. And in the seating area, there was like a QR code, and people were invited to, of course, sit down and scan the code. And then there was a link to a questionnaire. And the idea was not to put the questionnaire front and center, but more as a place where in the exhibition, you could sort of sit down quietly, sort of away from view, and like, you know, spend some time sitting comfortably on the chair, but within a relatively calm, contemplative environment. And then once you scan the QR code, it led you to a questionnaire. I skipped the introduction, but it was basically like this. And the first question was the description. To answer a question, drag the cursor to the value that corresponds to your answer. So you could say, if I was going to feel it, I would say I feel moderately focused. And then if I skip to the next, the idea was that you could decide to indicate a specific value. For example, in this case, anything between art has no political impact, art has no impact on political change, or culture is the core of all revolutions. But you could also double click on the cursor and then select a range of values. And the idea with this was to sort of develop the simplest possible methodology that would allow me, with the limited budget that I have, to program a kind of survey that would allow the maximum flexibility of answers within the simplest possible structure that's mobile friendly. And it's really hard when programming those things. Like I work with a programmer, it's just so hard to not have those things cost a fortune. So initially I wanted to have a structure that was like non-binary and had all sorts of cool options, but everything just costs too much money to make. So at the end, we realized that this sort of double cursor allowed for like either you double click and you have like one single value that you can choose, or when you double click, you can select whichever value. So it allows for a kind of non-binary answer within a binary structure. So it's not the best, but we found that it worked well enough. And then as people went to the question, there were like different parts in the questionnaire. And from previous questionnaires that I did in exhibitions, it was mostly about sort of speculative concepts, like, for example, like, where do you think humanity is going? Are we going towards destruction or improvement or progress or whatever? And in the past, I didn't have any specific socioeconomic questions or things about like, how old are you? It was more like, are you closer to birth or death? The problem that I found while doing those previous things is that, for example, people who are very rich would not necessarily indicate that they consider themselves very rich, or like age, people may, basically that it didn't allow any anchor points that sort of contributes the usual socioeconomic data that we want to have, even though the questionnaire is anonymous. Like it's hard to find basically like a good balance between collecting some specific data about people and also asking questions that are more philosophical. It's hard if you limit like the total questions to like say 20 questions and you want to collect some answer on people. It's very hard to, like normally 20 questions is about how many it takes to have good data on people. So that was one of the challenges in an exhibition context, to have like kind of an experimental / art survey that also has some demographics questions. So in this case, well, this was easy. People could indicate their age. The next question was one of the difficult ones about gender. In this case here, what I decided to do after consultation with a number of people was to ask the question in a way that would show the diversity of potential interpretation of that question. So here, on one side of the binary spectrum, you had, I feel 100% aligned with all the traditional aspects of quote unquote being a woman. In the middle, I do not feel aligned with any traditional aspect of quote unquote being a woman or quote unquote man. And at the bottom, I feel 100% aligned with all the traditional aspects of quote unquote being a man. And people could also select a range. So someone could select like this or the full spectrum. So after talking with a number of people, like this allowed people to embrace any part of the spectrum or no part of the spectrum or all of the spectrum. And so I'm going to skip to the results now because there's about 20 questions. I'm not going to go through all of them one by one, but it's just sort of to give you an idea of the sort of methodology that I was trying to use. In the results, what we see is a combination of, basically they're two-dimensional. What I did is that I grouped two questions together every time. So in this case, the first two questions, whether I feel distracted or I feel focused, and whether I think culture is the core of all revolutions or art has no impact on political change. The lines you see are people who indicated a spectrum between culture is the core of all revolutions and art has no impact on political change. And usually the first question about I feel distracted or not, I hadn't yet given the possibility of splitting the cursor. So most people insert a specific value on that axis. And then most people insert also a range of values on the other cursors. So this was just sort of the demo. And then when we get into it, here you have the intersection of age and gender. And what I thought was interesting, I forget exactly how many participants we had. I think it was around maybe 60 or 70, something like that. And there's only 4 persons who identified, I feel aligned with all the traditional aspects of being a man, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 who identified with all the traditional aspects of being a woman. And so for me, that was maybe like a way that tells that like this idea of the cursor allowing a range of values and the in-between allowed for like a fairly wide range of answers. And what I found interesting is that at the end, like very few people, like in a regular sort of survey, you would have maybe 3 positions at best, or sometimes more, but it's fairly rare that in official surveys we have more than 3 positions. So I thought that it was interesting that most of it is really in between. And also there was an option on this website to view results in 3D. So if we look at this here, unfortunately, I can't really zoom in more than this. You can see sort of how the data creates 3D shapes. And again, like the idea here is more sort of to experiment with how this multiplicity of positions between between two positions can be represented in 2D or 2D, and just to try, like, it really is an experimental process. And I guess, like, if this sort of builds a little city of sorts visually, it's like very, very few are on the edges. I'm going to set it back to 2D just because it's more simple. So as we progressed into the questionnaire, like, I also asked about money and privileged. And again, it was hard to, like, ask those questions in a way that feels fair to everyone without being super specific. So the questions here, and I'm very grateful for any comments or criticism or anything you may have about this, because I did the best I could, like consulting a bunch of people, but it's really experimental. So I'm not sure if I hit the right spot or not. Here it said, in terms of privilege, I've never felt any limits to what I could imagine, do, or become. And on the other side, I've always feel imprisoned in a life that I can change. This question in regards to privilege was a way to sort of try to address multiple factors without focusing on one specific factor. And then in terms of money, income, people had a choice. The original question was in comparison with Los Angeles County, where the median income for a family of 4 was $80,000 per year in 2021, or $56,000 for a one-person household. So in comparison with that, I asked people if they make a large abstract income and struggle to evade tax, or they make 2 or 3 times the median income and struggle to pay their mortgage, or they make the median income and struggle to pay their mortgage, or they make half the median income and struggle to keep a room, or make no money and life is a cactus I'm holding on to. The goal was to sort of give some parameters, but not too many. But sort of, if, say, you make 10 millions, you clearly could not say, oh, I'm just slightly more rich than the average. Like, you sort of had to go to the extreme, just so that we get still like a bit of flexibility in answers. And it's not really about the number, it's more about the proportions. And in terms of privilege, people situated themselves in different places on there. And again, for me, it was interesting to discover like someone who answers this answer, or that, or this one, like all shapes, because they're 2D, shapes have different meanings and can be interpreted in different ways. And in the interface that we build, if I select this answer, for example, then I can see the other answers that same person gave to other questions. So the interface allows for sort of looking for correlations, and I can select multiple answers as well and see where these people answers in other questions. So if I keep going, background, I asked people whether, well, everything I do in my life is for other persons who depend on me for their survival, or I don't have to take care of anyone. I just do whatever I want. So this was like another way to ask the privilege question from a different angle, and to consider the things about parents, people who take care of other people, dependents, or anything like that. And then on the other side, I was born and raised in a completely different place and culture. I couldn't feel less American, or I was born and raised in the US by Americans' parents in American culture. And here again, the range is pretty wide, what people answered. And then part 2, transformation. There were a number of questions about how people view the future. And in this case, like, my life has always followed a predictable trajectory, or I have lived through things that completely turn my life upside down. And in the future, I expect to live through truly dramatic events that will radically transform my life. Or in the future, my life will probably remain much like it is. And the goal of this question was to sort of set the tone for other questions about the change that people may anticipate or imagine the future. So that if ever people further down the questionnaire answer questions about how they imagine the future of humanity, then we can also select them and see what they answered here, if they have lived through radical change already or not, and how to correlate those answers. Now here, direction and responsibility. how we govern ourselves in the next 20 years will directly impact life on Earth for millennia to come, or we have no agency to change larger historical processes that are already in motion. Now, clearly, people believe we have more responsibility towards the future. And then it'll be harder to live on Earth. The social order will collapse. We'll enter a new dark age, or we'll make constant progress and achieve civilizational maturity and wisdom. People clearly see things more like dramatically negative in terms of the future. Like here, there's a few rectangles that stretch on this side, but overall, people are much more see much more the negative impacts in terms of like the number of people who answer. Almost everyone is in this quadrant here. And if we keep going, this one was an interesting one for me. Technology will bring divine bliss to all people and deliver us from the human condition, or technology will bring new unimaginable forms of iniquity and oppression. And here again, people like clearly believe that things are not going to go that well. The thing that surprised me more was that on the horizontal axis, technological progress will give us control over life, death, time, and space, and something will happen and we'll enter a phase of technological regression. A surprising number of people believe that we'll enter a phase of technological regression, which I thought was surprising because I imagine that there's just so much money being poured into tech that it's hard to imagine regression unless you see it from a philosophical point of view. But just technically speaking, I thought that was kind of surprising. But a lot of people believe that we'll enter technological regression. So anyway, there's a few questions along those lines and a few more about, for example, intergenerational justice. In this case, if the state destroyed my life and that of my family, we and our descendants should let go and move on, or we should have a reparation. And I would be ready to make amends for the crimes of previous generations from which I benefited, or I shouldn't be held responsible for crimes I didn't commit. So here there's a pretty strong response, like a pretty strong concentration of responses in the top quadrant. But it's still interesting to see that the number of people just really don't believe in paying reparations. And then there is, I'm not going to go through all the questions one by one, but there's a number of questions about imagining the future, if things will go well or not, and where will people be if things go wrong, whether they'll feel good and enjoy a climatized dome, or they'll be roasting in the heat with no resources. And if they believe that if things go well, it'll be because a beautiful post-capitalist world emerged, which is a large majority of people believe. Or if all goes well, it'll be because capitalism helped us innovate, creating economic growth and prosperity for all. Very few people believe that. Of course, it's like not representative of the larger population, it's just a gallery crowd. But maybe the last thing I will share with you, there's a few more questions, but then there are the comments. So I included all the comments that were left in the forums, which range from "Bah" to "Great survey" to "Hi, I like art. I hope you like art too." And there's like a wide range of answers that are just transcribed directly. And on the website too, you can sort of select a comment and see what the person has replied in the different diagrams. And then also in the options on top, I included a place where we can select things like, for example, age and I don't know, responsibility for the future. And then that will show like a custom diagram showing the relationship between those two questions. So overall, it's really just sort of an experimental tool to experiment with I guess to experiment with how we think about existential questions. At least like for me, that was the goal, is like, I always ask myself those sort of like big picture questions. And I'm always a bit like struggling to find ways to ask those questions because they're so like lofty and big and hard to ask and hard to quantify. even hard to like find a framework to ask those questions. So this for me is really just sort of like uh, a way to try to play with these questions and to try to play with data as a medium to see what is measurable and what is not measurable and how we go about measuring things. It's just sort of the methodology of the project. And I'm also doing another one this summer for a small suburban triennial near Montreal, where I'll ask more questions about ecological change and access to resources and the use of resources in space. So if ever you have any, like, I see there's some questions or comments in the chat that I'll read, but if anyone has any ideas or criticism or comments or whatever, like, I'm working on these questionnaires sort of on an ongoing basis. So I'm taking any feedback whatsoever.
How do these questionnaires relate to the painting and the installation that you started with?
I can show quickly, like so for example, let me try to find one that relates more directly or is a bit more easy to see. So this painting, for example, is like, I can't, okay. It's like a diagram that maps the political positions. So in my paintings in general, I try to find ways to sort of integrate some research about societal structures, economic structures, and to give them a visuality that's a bit more meditative and less just informational. But there's always like a huge surplus of research from the painting process. And then at some point, I decided to do something with it. And it ended up being a questionnaire a few years ago. And then somehow I thought nobody would like to do it, but it seemed that people actually really enjoyed filling the questionnaire. So I just sort of decided to keep going for it. And then I had a grant from the Canada Arts Council to pursue that. So I've been sort of experimenting with that since then. Oh, Chrissy, I see you have your hand.
Hi.
Hey.
So first of all, I have had a crush on your work for years. It's so sexy. It's not fair. It's like inappropriately sexy. And so I was thinking about when I do questionnaires, because I have a philosophy degree, I think of them like a logic proof. Like, and so
Interesting.
I think of it as like one idea should lead the person into the next idea that should lead the person into the next idea, and that like you could use these questions to like. So when you talked about something really struck for me when you talk about like we asked them this question and then later on you can look at another question that they asked that they answered and then you can go back and look for correlations, because the way that I build questions is to like psychologically manipulate people into being more open to more invasive things later. and and it's the same way with like as like a producer and director, how like you kind of like you always make shooting run like a little bit late to like get the actors to like relax, or you do it to like make them have more anxiety, or you do it to like all of these kinds of things. And so there's a lot of psychological manipulation that can happen within the way that the questions are placed in order. And so I was wondering like how much you think about that, because I was also, it was like, I just saw it as like so different. I was like, oh, right. Yeah. Because you could look for correlations. And like that had never occurred to me because I'm so uninterested in the product. I'm so uninterested in the actual data. I'm so much more interested in the process of experiencing our data being taken from us. And so I think so much about like all the psychological manipulation that happens in the process of being questioned and interrogated in these things, even if it's voluntary. And so I just wonder how much you think about like how you're manipulating your viewer in some way, because we're all manipulative. Like we have to be that's the point of art. It's like, right? And like shape, color, line manipulates people. Like these things all manipulate people. So I was wondering how much you think about that in the like order of things that you
Right.
ask, or the, because it seems like you move in phases,
Mhm.
that you put the questions in phases. Do you think about like asking people about gender before poverty? Like that could get more fucked up, or do you think about like being less fucked up and think, because like all of that.
I mean, I think like overall, I mean, it's true, everything is just so manipulative in questions, but I honestly
Yeah.
try to like be as fair as possible. Like, I
I
guess
see that
I,
and I'm kind of wondering why. Like,
well,
do you think it's actually possible to be fair? And like, what is your, like, sorry, everybody, philosopher. Like, what do you think is the good here? And like, how do you go for it?
I think like, okay, so I think this is part of like the cat arts education model where like I remember being in crits and how to discuss works that are completely open-ended and subjective, right? And the best teacher I had this methodology of we all began to talk about the stuff that is completely objective. And then progressively, as you have named a bunch of stuff, you realize at some point you're talking about stuff and it has become subjective and you don't really realize when it happens, but at some point it slides into a subjective territory. So I guess I'm kind of trying to do that, like going from the easiest things to answer, like
It's
age.
formalist data.
Interesting. I'm not sure I would be willing to accept the term formalist, but I see. I'll probably have
It's
to fight
pretty
with it
formal
myself. Um, but there's something about that, about the sort of getting into like, it's easy to answer like, how old are you? You just answer it. And then the questions become more and more open-ended. And so it goes more about like specific data, then sort of how's your life? And then how do you view life? And then how do you imagine the future down the road? Um,
Do
so for
you think about how that affected you psychologically in crit, and how therefore it is affecting your viewers, or like your participants?
Yeah, because I think it's like setting the mood, right? And I really really like this. I like the reason why I make the paintings the way I do is because I'm so into like creating an atmosphere or a kind of mood. Like it's like walking into a James Turrell for me is like such a fun experience. And also once I am in a James Turrell, I don't think of reality as black and white or harsh concept or whatever. I just feel like everything has a soft edge to it. It's like, it's a different vibe, I guess. So in my visual work, I try to create a vibe that is also kind of softer. The concepts may be sometimes harsh, but I like it to be told with softness somehow. Um, and so I kind of like with a questionnaire to move softly into the stuff, like progressively, and set the mood so that you sort of feel that like you've earned the trust progressively as you walk into the questionnaire.
So like a DJ.
Yeah, sort of. And I guess that's manipulative in a different way, right?
Yeah.
But I try I try to be as fair as possible in the sense that like I will I try to do it sincerely, I guess.
No, it totally reads as sincere. That's why I also am so like I'm like shocked by the level of sincerity and authentic. Like that's one of the things I think I that is so exciting about your work, is that it is so like sexy and ridiculously, I think it's pretty formal, but and I feel like it's really interestingly in conversation with California Hard Edge, which I went to Claremont, so it's like I have a forced relationship with hard edge abstraction.
Mm.
Um, and even though it's like it's all really soft, the graphics of the data feel so hard edge painting to me, and that
Mhm.
it feels like it feels like it's in conversation with like Billy Al Bankston in a weird way and stuff too. That's like kind of funny, but that's the thing I think is so seductive about it, is that like it doesn't read as like intentionally psychologically manipulative. Like it does read as like, hey, will you go on a journey with me? Like,
Yeah, well, I mean, that's how I feel about it. But at the same time, it's like, how do you get people to actually answer questions about because I feel like if somebody came to me and be like, hey, do you think in 20 years from now humanity will be down the drain or will we be doing fine? I'll be like, who the fuck are you? Like, from which perspective are you asking me the question? So I think it's like to try to get an answer where people will actually spend the time to ponder, like to really think about it, it sort of needs to progressively leads towards that. But then that's also like, but one thing too is that like at the end of the questionnaire, there's a question where I ask people if the questions felt that they matched their concerns, and also if they answered honestly and accurately, or they answered like randomly. And most people really do like answer that yes, it corresponds to their own concerns. And I feel like in general, in surveys that I have filled, nobody ever asked me what I thought about the survey or if it was relevant. And sometimes it's totally not relevant. So I'm thinking too that perhaps in other surveys, like I was thinking of ways of protesting the questions by just having a slider that just blacks out the question. So that at the end you could have, for example, like a mosaic of images of everything that people have answered, and the questions that are the darkest, or maybe let's say like a slider towards red or whatever, like it would indicate that people hate those questions. It's just that like I'm not sure if it will actually work visually. I have to work with this. But right now, for example, like I'm working with the next one, and it's in Quebec, it's in Montreal, and the art world is not very well, it's not very diverse here. And I want, especially not in the suburbs. So I wanted to ask questions about race, but nobody monitors race. I mean, it's Canada, it's not US. It's starting here, but there's, especially in Quebec, a complicated relationship with race issues. So what I thought of doing, and perhaps if anyone has an opinion on this, I would be interested in knowing, I thought of doing a question with sliders of colors like RGB, or like cyan, magenta, and black, and ask people to create a color that matches their skin tone. And they would just see a square, and then they would just try to make the color. And then at the end, there would be a mosaic of all the colors that people answers. And this is like linked to a number of precedents. There was like this one artist whose name I forget at the moment, who once sat in front of the Met in New York and asked people if he could paint their portrait. It was a Black artist, and people who said yes, he would just simply match their skin color and make a square with this. So it's sort of in line with this sort of methodology. And also, like, whoever has any try to paint or mix a color that's like any kind of skin tone quickly realizes that there is every color on the palette in every skin tone, regardless of which one it is. So it's kind of an exercise like this. So I'm trying to like think of ways of integrating sort of like more open processes within the questionnaire, or asking questions like, imagine your city now, what color is it? Mix that color. And then the next question is like, imagine your city in 50 years from now, what color is it? And then asking people to mix that color.
I've got a thing of advice for that one. I think it'd be interesting if you start, this is kind of going off of like what Christy does when there's the feeling of realizing you're being tracked. So the first thing is that it actually assumes the color and then portrays it. So it's like, is this accurate? And it shows a skin tone color on an RGB. And then you'd say, do you want to change this? And then you can slide it up for saturation, lightness, darkness. But then I think you could have something arbitrary like, what is your favorite color? And then that becomes the portrait is like two colors, the color from how you changed it from what a camera claims is the color it picked up. Because then it's talking about even like representation of color. Like I know Kodak is one of the only companies that is remembered for having like the photo process didn't take into account darker skin tones, but that would then make you aware that the thing that's judging you has a neutral idea, and then that has no basis. So I feel like that's interesting to me about like, not really a blend between what Christy's talking about and what you're talking about, but it has less to do with even choice of what do I think is my skin color? And then I think it becomes a problem of how do you make color? But if it starts off with, this is what we're going to say is your color, do you accept or not? Then it's a different question. And it actually gives an accessibility to what does it mean to represent your color and see your color represented that you then have to agree to.
Right,
so
right.
I feel like that psychologically creates a mindset about the surface of race. Although in my head, I almost want to be like, I don't know if you should do this project at the same time, just because I don't know how I feel about art projects about race that are surface oriented, honestly. Because I still think of race as not just being a social construction, but being a lived experience that most people assume has nothing to do with race. And then people don't get it when you explain like racial capitalism had nothing to do with skin color and everything to do with hierarchies. Like, that's where I think it gets so tricky of like, how much information do you put next to the skin color test, because the context of race does need more than like a slider, I guess.
I know, and that's a tricky question also for gender and also for privilege. I think like these kinds of questions are like, I mean, race is even more polemical. But it's like, on one hand is like either you ask the question and then it's very difficult, or you don't ask the question and then you sort of bypass the issue altogether. So I find it hard in those questionnaires because it's like, it's not about any of those issues specifically, but it's about a perspective that doesn't exclude those issues either, right? So it's a hard call. I feel like I think you put your finger on an interesting point where it's like, how do you ask the questions without staying on the surface?
And I think a thing that seems missing a little bit, which is why I feel like I kind of agree with Christy that it's like a formalist appearance, because I'm not going to lie, it's so fun to like zoom in and abstract the data. Mm-hmm. But I was thinking about the conflict of usefulness, because if you're a doctor and you want to get someone to tell you how much pain they're in, information is super important. But in your art project, the stakes are so low. So it's hard for me to know how to answer the question of how do you get people to answer your questions, because if the stakes are low, then that's I feel like the answer to how you get people to answer your questions. But I was just thinking how great your information would have been if instead of text, if it was memes. So here's a meme of someone who's like a really hardcore masculine identity. Here's a meme of someone who's really feminine identity. Here's a meme of someone who doesn't feel like a gender. Here's a meme of someone like, there's something about even selecting from a given stereotype that it's way easier to take that seriously and commit to the identity. Because I was noticing that when I was having people deal with identifying as neurodivergent, it was like really an uphill battle because there's just so much trauma around identity in that way. But if we could make our own bad memes, it was so interesting that suddenly there was a little bit more like figuring out how do you want to express this, or if you feel like you can't. So then your quadrants would be between, I don't even know how to begin to describe versus I can describe and I refuse. So I feel like that would be, as they say, a picture speaks 1,000 words. I'd be then super curious to see how that data would change just in terms of the seriousness that people took, which I think is different than sincerity, if that makes sense. There's like a precision that someone's like, yeah, I'm not going to take this too seriously, but I'll answer the best I can.
Right. Yeah, it's tricky. I feel that like this is like among the stuff that like is hard to measure and also hard to use the right words or the right information. Like memes are interesting also. And also it what you're describing also taps on a question that Ari wrote, wondering how you came up with the language for the question. I mean, that's the tricky part, right? It's like the language or the memes or whatever, like a photo or anything you use as a way to like, I don't know, give positions. I mean, how I came up with this language was by trial and error and asking a bunch of people what they thought about the questions and how they felt about it. But it's also like, it varies a lot. Like I've asked multiple versions of these questions, and usually I'll write the same question like 30 times before I figure out a way to ask it that seems that it doesn't cut out any possibilities. And the thing about memes that can be potentially really interesting as well as potentially damaging is how do you deal with like stereotypes or caricatures that one person feels totally fine with, but the other ones feel really aggressed by. Like it's hard to tell. I remember teaching a painting class, and one student made a painting. One was like a blue hard-edged square, and it was called um, The Successful Businessman, and made like a curvy red painting that was called A Sensual Woman. And everyone in the classroom exploded. Like people started to yell at each other. Like I had never seen a reaction that violent in a classroom. And it was because of the stereotyping that happened that people just got like totally pissed off and just like, and there was no civil, like there was no polite discussion. It was just like explosions everywhere. And I was like, holy shit, like that really came out of like, those paintings were like, you know, the stereotypical imagery combined with like the style of painting was just like really hitting on everyone's nerves. And I feel that like how do you, like, how would that apply, for example, with memes? It's sort of like Cedric, you're probably right. To create a social media platform and galvanize those emotions into profit. I'll make a subsidiary arm of the pluralism website to do that. But yeah, anyway, it's I don't know. Those are tough questions. I feel like I could try like maybe a version of this with memes, or I'll have alternative, like have people select if they prefer to answer text question or memes question, like something like a gamification of the questionnaire could be an interesting way to do it.
I was literally just thinking that because I was thinking about like the Bandersnatch Black Mirror where you can like pick your own path. Like I'm wondering because so like one of the big things about my question about like how questionnaires are psychologically manipulative is that they're also psychologically triggering depending on your lived experiences. And like I think that I don't have a problem with confrontation, but I also like seek harm reduction. And so I'm also like wondering how we can create spaces where, like, when so many of my friends' work is exclusively about creating spaces for healing, that should tell me that the majority of spaces feel traumatizing to them, not just unhealed or unsafe, but literally traumatizing to them. And so I wonder about the not all of us and our experiences like come to the questionnaire experience differently. And so I'm wondering if gamification, kind of like not everybody experiences the same questionnaire, is a way to think about how some questions are just not appropriate for some people.
Right. Right.
And how to take them in a in that there are like almost like rhizomatic paths that the questionnaire kind of branches throughout and becomes more diverse and more complicated and more, because I think that's why I interrogate the concept of of data gathering in the first place, is because our lives are just too our lives are just too complex. We are too complex. Our sexuality is too complex. Everybody's queer. Like it's it's like like everything, our chemicals are too complex. Like
I mean, I think it's part also of like the major problem with those big picture questions is that like any subject you talk about, it's like either you only ask about a question superficially or you dive into it. But if you dive into it, you need the entire questionnaire to be about that one thing. And for me, I guess the major question is, how do you make a questionnaire, or just how do you discuss like big picture questions that try to take into account like everything? So it's like you have to acknowledge that you cannot take into account everything, but then you're like, okay, but let's try anyway to go towards a more of a general, not universal, but general perspective, where you're like, overall, how does that feel? Like overall, do we feel that like shit's gonna hit the fan, or we feel that like things are getting better and shit's gonna hit the fan, or like how do we feel about all those things? And then I guess like the choose your own adventure questionnaire is sort of like could be like a good way of of allowing more complexity to feed in, perhaps. The problem with that is that it's expensive to build. Like it's quite costly to do those things. And I wanted to do one where it's just like a graffiti wall, for example. So like I imagine a questionnaire where you go down vertically. So you do a question. Once you're done, there's an arrow going down or an arrow going sideways or like diagonal down. And so you could sort of follow it like a tree, like no matter which direction you take, you would end up at the bottom. But you like if you like a question, you could click a side arrow and it would lead you to like another question about a similar issue or a different version of it. And if you don't want to, you just skip and you go down to the next subject. But you could sort of, if there's a question you like or something and the subject you want to tap into, you could like go there. Or there could be like a question that's just like, try to like, I don't know, how do you feel? And then there's like color sliders and you mix a color that's like how you feel. It's not related to the rest. So, or like a graffiti wall where you just inscribe something and every drawing or doodle that everybody will make during the full 3 months of the show will just stay there forever. Like those kind of questions that sort of break the logic of a survey or something and makes it feel a bit more like a choose your own adventure thing, or like you're sort of living an experience that you can sort of tailor as you go along.
What you're describing kind of makes me think of like a branching tree for like a chatbot. Like if the customer gives you this answer, then you can ask this question, and if the customer answers this way, then this is the next response.
So that it functions according to the response, it would sort of direct you towards, yeah. I mean, yes, that would be interesting. It would probably be more costly, but it would be super interesting though. I could probably like test it on a small scale. It's like depending on in which quadrant you fall, like it may recommend something, or yeah, that would be interesting.
Also, was that artist you were referencing, was that Byron Kim?
I think so, yes.
Yeah.
It's like every time like that's I have thought about that project, like it has become like, I think somebody presented to me like, I don't know, 15 years ago in a crit, and it has like stayed with me since then. And I feel like it's one of those things that like has had like a profound and direct influence on everything that I've been thinking about in terms of like colors and shapes and how to think about like how like the formal qualities of something can have like a profound significance. Yeah.
Sorry, what is the artwork or the artist that you're referencing?
I'll put it in the chat.
I mean, it just, as you were talking, we were talking about language and like, what are the, like, how do these questions, I was just thinking about like, well, isn't that the function of poetry? Like, essentially, is to find a way to kind of track the data of our lives through to ourselves. Like in ascension, like, and essentially, like, isn't that the function of poetry? To read a questionnaire to ourselves without it being a questionnaire. And because every time I think of questionnaires, I always think of like Yoko Ono and these like conceptual questions as like the parent of this kind of work in a way. And I just think like, oh, well, it's really, I wonder if, because yeah, I wonder if you think of this as poetry. And I mean, the cactus made me think maybe.
I mean, well, I mean, it's a trick. Like, I fight my own impulses all the time to just make it more subjective and more towards poetry in some ways. I find it hard. I feel like the more I include things like that, the more when I consult people, they're just like, I'm not sure this is a good idea. It's like, it's the problem with whenever it's dealing with information, the further along you go from like the median way of thinking, and then the less there is common ground, and then the more people have their own ways of thinking about it. And that's what's interesting about art. But with data, it's like, I find it like super tough. And I always see that thing of like the combination of, say, like didactic and poetic, for me, is what really interests me in art in general. And like, for example, in terms of painters, like Kerry James Marshall would be like one of my most profound influences, I would say, not directly, but because of the combination of the didactic and the poetic. And I feel that like like to be able to do both for me, sort of like making a sphere stand on the tip of a pyramid, it's like impossible, but you can maybe freeze the moment for a second when it holds, and that's the work, if you can manage. So yeah, I mean, I think it is the function of poetry. I just think that like the more poetic you are, the harder it is to make it have some kind of to make it fit like something that can be measured.
Or the more you call it poetry, you're suddenly in a different funding category that makes you eligible for National Poetry Foundation funding, and then you get to increase your budget in order to create your poetry chatbot that takes people down their own choose your own adventure questionnaire.
That
I'm
would be
just
cool.
like,
I'd be
the
down.
more intersections that you can find to describe the work, the more funding positions you find yourself in. You could be a playwright by next month, and this could be interactive theater. You get what I'm,
Yes. That's a
pick
good
up
point.
what I'm
That's a good
putting
point.
down? All right.
That's a good point.
I feel like the poetry part of it is the way that you've broken, like the way that you've created the ability for someone to create like a whole rectangle or square, which is like breaking apart basically this attempt at measuring things, right? With like data trying to be this way of categorizing and like things that, I mean, I learned this from the census. In our first year, we spent a year creating a survey, and there's so many rabbit holes that we went down. And, I always reference Borges's story of the man who's trying to create the map of the world.
Yeah.
And eventually, and he keeps going more and more detailed. And eventually the map is a 1-to-1 scale of the world, right? It's like exactly that kind of thinking. And then it's also making me think, I pulled it up, this Trincy Minha quote, which she has many great quotes when it comes to information and information sharing. But it's, despite all of our desperate, eternal attempts to separate, contain, and mend, categories always leak, And so I feel like that ability to take the survey, and I mean, you could make a box over the entire grid, it's like in a way, like a you could call it a non-answer, or, like I don't know, like a rebellion towards, confining yourself within your options. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think like the sort of like relatability of the process versus question versus like methods of poetry is like, I don't know, I feel like finding ways of doing it, like you say, like the rabbit hole is just like so deep. Like if you're going, like when you start making the map is just infinite. And then the question is more about like which kind of map you're interested in making and why, like that becomes interesting. But I find it so hard. Honestly, it's like, it's easy to just ask questions, but to make it feel relevant and not a waste of time, I honestly find it really hard.
I also think about those silly like online quizzes, like what kind of, I don't know, what kind of Muppet are you? Which Muppet are you? Or,
Right.
like these really kind of superficial quizzes that are like a series of questions, and then it results in something that tells you something about yourself, supposedly. And I feel like your questionnaire is kind of, it's somewhere in between trying to learn something about the audience and trying to teach or have the audience learn something about themselves. And I feel like there's a kind of, I know there's something to think about in the whimsy of these kind of flippant online questionnaires.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there's like, they're kind of irresistible in some ways, like especially the first times you're just like, oh, there's just something fundamentally intriguing about it. And it's about this sort of whimsy quality. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's what my questionnaire lack. They're kind of like, they're pretty boring. Like, they're pretty dry. It's like, I try to make them clean and make them work well, but they're kind of dry.
Actually, I don't think they're dry at all. At least the
No?
questions that I saw, the way you phrase them, there's this sort of this wry kind of humor to the way you pose the questions. Like I don't have the examples up in front of me to see anymore, but it like the way you describe like the end of the world or like this bright future, like the
Can you
role
pull them up
technology.
again?
Yeah, because typically questions in a survey are meant to be very clinical and like sterile, objective. These are not. These are poetic. So you absolutely are doing interactive poetry.
Well, they're
Okay, well,
also they're very long, which I think like also with, you know, the more traditional survey building, you want to be specific, but also very concise, or as concise as possible, because you're taking people's time and you're trying to create clarity, where yours are sort of lengthy and they kind of are this, in a way, they're like a, do you know what I mean? Kind of like they're trying to nudge you into this, like this kind of thing, you know?
Yeah, but they're also being suggestive, it's very suggestive that both are true. Like you're not, like, it's not a true binary. Like both can be true. And it's,
Right.
and so that's like, I mean, it's confronting what a survey is supposed to be. Like,
And
Right,
like
I
the
mean-
way you phrase certain questions, it's like you're, by having a respondent align with a certain end of that spectrum, it's like you're forcing them in this position where they're also acknowledging and associating themselves with a whole host of other things you've put into that question.
right. And
A
I mean,
little bit like that, like dismiss button, like, no, I do not want to receive an intellectual newsletter because I'm a dumb person.
Yeah, that's, you know, like I actually do think about that a lot while writing these questions. Like I remember the first one I wrote, I asked a friend of mine, like the first one I wrote, I did it in such a hurry, like in like 2 days, and we cut little pieces of paper with little things written on them and we assembled them. And it was like in Western Canada, like in Edmonton, where there's lots of oil money. And it was like related to like a big art prize where a lot of very rich, wealthy people from oil money will come. And so I forget what the question was, but there was a question that was like, we basically about like defending the right values. And one question, like one side of the question was just like, we should fight the establishment and protect our liberties and freedom of speech and blah, blah, blah. And the other side was like, we should fight the establishment and protect social fabric and blah, blah, blah. But both were fighting the establishment regardless of which side you were in. And my friends recommended to do that. And I realized that like, yeah, it's like no one sees himself as the establishment, for example. So you kind of have to embrace that in the questions and to just adjust it and say like there could be a question of like, I don't know, like both sides, it's like, I am dumb and do not accept this thing. But the other side is also like, I am dumb and does not, like, I don't accept that thing either. Like, I think this is maybe a way to like, perhaps make it less polarizing in the, like to have a dynamic that doesn't feel judgmental. And it's so hard because I feel like I am so full of judgments towards like certain sets of values. But it's really hard to like not let that shine through the questions. But anyway, I'm glad if it reads more like a bit more like poetry and less dry, because after reading them so many times and rewriting them, to me, it feels very, very dry. And also they've been like triple edited. Like usually my questions were like 6 times as long. There was like a long paragraph to describe each position. They were really meandering. So they're a lot more concise now, I think. I'm glad that they're not too concise, though. Honestly, I have no critical distance at this point at all with this. I have no clue what I think of the whole thing. So thanks for your feedback. It's very appreciated. I'll try to think of it as poetry. Maybe it will open up some doors.
Yeah, and my thought was like how much care it takes to craft a survey. And usually you're meant to be objective, inclusive, predicting the possibilities of how people answer questions. This is really, I feel like the care you're taking is in the actual language, not so much in the designing a functional survey.
No, for sure.
It is a project about language.
Yeah. I mean, also to some extent about the visuals at the end, because the first one I did, the visuals were like a cloud of dots, and in that way it was easier to quantify. But then a lot of a number of people commented that the problem with that was that like it felt very binary, and that was a problem. And which is why this time I had like the range selection that allowed for like rectangles and all sorts of shapes. So that way it's like less binary and also less legible at the end. It becomes a bunch of shapes, and it's a lot harder to reduce the content to like, oh, like 8% of people think this. It's like, no, it's like a rectangle, like a rectangle of various qualities and transparency levels
Yeah.
is more in the side of thinking that perhaps we should maybe not do that. Or
Yeah, and it also gives the option of you can then take that data and be like, if they give you a range, you can select the midpoint, and then you can compare the results for the range versus the results if you plot it by midpoint.
Interesting. I didn't think about
Yeah.
that. Or switching, moving the midpoint. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was also thinking maybe if you wanted to collaborate, because as a French-speaking person, I was thinking about Aircam and what kind of software Aircam could develop, because they developed a lot of the like max sound stuff that's like 12 16 20 something channel, like inner like surround sound. And I just keep thinking of like how this translates to sound.
Wow. Yeah, that's interesting. That just kind of blew my mind. Yeah, I would have to think of, like, that's a super interesting way to think about it. It's like how to use a completely different medium to experiment the same concepts. Yeah.
Yeah, so if you wanted to
Yeah.
meet about that, because I've been working with Aircam on like a synesthesia software. So if you wanted to meet about that, I'm just thinking of like, it would be so, it's so easy to program sound response. And sound is something that like gets all over everything.
Right. Right.
And so sound is really hard to isolate in a way that like looking at a square that has a hard edge that doesn't touch anything else, you know, sound gets all over everything, but sound also has location. And
Right.
so it's like, you know, a sound comes from, one of my grad school professors was Michael Brewster, who like the sound drawing guy. He used to make drawings with sound by embedding little Arduino speakers into the wall. So sound has a location. You can hear where it's coming and you know where the sound's coming from, but it also gets all over everything.
That's like super interesting. I would be totally down to discuss that. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I don't know much about sound theory, but I see it popping more and more into like all sorts of fields, like from architecture, forensic architecture, or like a bunch, like so many people are using it in super, super interesting ways in relation to like space, power, dynamics, all sorts of stuff. So yeah, I would be super, super interested in finding out more about that. Yeah.
Yeah, and the tech is so easy now, like to program all the different speakers and yeah, and also I'm programming at Mocha for at least the next year. I have a partnership with them. So I got like one Saturday a month in the plaza. We could put like put a prototype out.
Wow, that'd be cool. It's a
Mhm.
good place. It's a good place to test that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I have a budget, so you know, we don't have to pay to make it.
Yeah, it's interesting thinking about, I don't have a relationship with sound as an artist, like as a creator, but I use it for like a somatic practice that I do. So when I think of sound, I very much think of like the body, the vibrations that it creates within our body, which is, you know, then the feelings that brings up, whether it's anxiety, or I was just asking my brother this morning for like a soothing soundtrack because I was so anxious. And Nicholas's the show that he had the survey in also, and I find the survey also to be like much more like somatically conscious than any other survey, I think, because of it, you know, trying to expand the way that we collect information and define things. but even like within the exhibition, having colors, so like that other sensory element. And then the exhibition design, which if anybody, you know, went to it, it's like you're walking through these spaces that he's created within the gallery, you know, so things are kind of unfolding proprioceptively, you know, with your body as a space becomes more confined and you're bringing your body into that space. And then you find your way, you know, through this organization of space and through this spatial experience that your body is proprioceptively having, you find your way into this space where this survey is sitting. And then, you know, then you're kind of also winding your way into the experience of this, you know, alternative survey. So I'm just thinking of all of those things with like that sound component. Sounds really, it just makes sense with, I guess, like an evolution or like a continued experimentation of that somatic aspect that I feel from it.
Yeah, and I think that like sound for me is closely related to color. Like when I work on preparing a painting, I usually prepare colors on Photoshop and play with colors. And often whenever I listen to music, it's like it has a very, very strong influence on what I will, like the kind of mood I want to create in painting. It's like if I listen to, I don't know, a very old Kraftwerk song, for example, and I'm just like, damn, like this has that particular quality that I'd like somehow to translate into painting. And the sound and color is like an interesting translation. And so for a questionnaire, like I'm just thinking it'd be interesting to just have like, I don't know, like just a hum, for example, or just like, and it's like a mid-range, and you have a slider and you answer all the questions by putting the slider up or down. And then like, for example, if 50 people answer, you have the kind of white noise created by those 50 people as the collective answer to that question. And as you move from question to question, you see the shift going up or down. And that doesn't translate into anything necessarily logical, but it could translate into like a very strong emotional feeling towards the question. So I think like that kind of stuff could be like super interesting to explore. And I mean, this is just like, sorry, I'm brainstorming aloud, but I just feel like, yes, I'm super interested in sound and questions. I feel like the potential to tap on the collective subconscious is really what I'm trying to do with these questions. And I think that maybe something like sound or color are ways to do it more directly than text, or at least both, maybe, I don't know.
I know how to program a theremin with just an Arduino. And it's a theremin that I can program with distance. And so what you could do is you could set the slider for the distance, and then that would control the pitch that the theremin plays.
Oh, wow. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's just like the prototyping. And then obviously, like if you got funding, then we could make a bigger version of that. But like just the prototype is actually really easy.
Oh, I'm down to talk more about that for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah. The theremin I brought to the O-Park fair or whatever.
It is such an amazing object.
Yeah, it's just like a distance sensor, and you program it to play a note based on whatever distance something is away from it. And you can program whatever scale you want. So you can make it play like a terrible like 12 tone, get like a Schoenberg choir, just like horror. Dead cats everywhere. Or you can make it all in C and make it really beautiful, you know.
Yeah, beats could be interesting too. Like tempo, for example.
Yeah, that's also totally doable because you can you program how long every note plays. So you could make it like a super staccato, and so you could hook it up to, I've hooked it up to bigger diameters, and it gets lower and lower depending on how big, so you could just like make your own. There's lots of, you know. Yeah, I'm surprised you don't get more funding though, really? Like
It's well, you know, so far I did get some, but it's more a matter of like I still haven't done the grant report for that last project, and I need to do that before I can apply for more. It's such a long, hard process that like it's just time basically.
But once you get your language, like get like a docket of all your language and all your materials together, make yourself a mission statement, make yourself like a statement of all the things that you do, who your audience is, get yourself like a template of a letter of interest together, and get yourself a template of like whatever like materials, kind of like the kind of materials that you work with and what they cost, or like the last project that you got funding for, like put up like set up a budget like template for that. If you just like set up templates for everything, then you just plug in whenever something comes up. And this is what I've been doing for K-Chung since I became CEO. Is I just like we have like a folder, and this way what I can also do is, since we have a template that I made, I can send it to somebody else in K-Chung, and I don't have to do all the other things anymore. So you can get help that way as well. Help. You could have help.
That would be good.
You could ask for help.
Cedric, you've added a bunch of things to the chat, and I just wonder if you want to vocalize anything.
Wait, all of the things in the chat? Or just like,
I didn't say all the things. I just said some, I don't know, a bunch of things. You don't have to say anything. I just thought.
oh, I was just thinking about when different worlds blend. So like Clara Takanabe has been doing a lot with art.coop, and that group has been talking about like mutualism, solidarity economies. And then meanwhile, in their other work, they have this thing that is like a clinically created music. And I think there's like a name for it, like CDRIM. But in my head, I was thinking about like the way that things look clinical and like have a certain hard edge to it. But then like in the background, there's like, I was thinking about the context of Nicolas's work where there's like the socialism video and then there's the survey. So like, I feel like it helps to have this context of things like, oh, these questions are in contrast to Art Prize. Oh, there's this music that's about the body. That's also in the context of trying to like be part of a better society. So I'm just thinking about the ways that we all have like multiple projects and how it helps to see them in context of each other, because there can be quite radical things within stuff that looks straightforward or something. And I was just trying to figure out how to describe like getting into things that have more of a political component, or basically when you feel very judgmental. So I was wondering, like, what does it mean if you offer more vulnerability and you're like, this is a self-portrait of me through a how I think creating a questionnaire looks. And then you would almost want to say that this is me trying to explore answers towards maybe socialism, but I'm extremely judgmental. Maybe that's one of the blocks to socialism. So it's like some parts seemed missing that I feel like I get because I know more of the context, but I'd be curious if it's worth being more direct. And I don't think that's always the case. I don't know if it always helps to be like super clear about what you are trying to do and why and where you come from, because then I think you do get less poetic responses. But it's just like a kind of general feeling of when I feel like people make art, there's like an idea, an experiment, and you just have to test it. So I feel like it's interesting seeing how I imagine your tests develop over time. But I definitely think you should consider how much of your own personal story you might want to put into it, because that could be interesting to even get other people to understand. I was thinking of, oh shoot, there was an artist who went around with like a thing on wheels that was a big, I want to say voice bubble that says, the truth is ... And then it toured around, I think, Detroit, where it's like people would talk about, well, the truth is blah, blah, blah. I think it was Hank Willis Thomas who did this piece. And to me, like, it's not about race, but I feel like people get into race when you position things in these kinds of ways, if that makes sense. So where it goes changes the data that you collect, and who the artist is makes more people feel comfortable about if they want to be involved, and where it goes from there. But these are like subtle ways that I think context really plays a lot into the kinds of ways that you end up forming a questionnaire or even representing the experiment.
So in a way, what you're saying is sort of like, it could be helpful to have like two things. One could be like, I could, for example, have some things where I let myself be more vulnerable as like the artist who made a questionnaire, for example. Like, for example, having like a paragraph that's a story of something happened to me or something, like just a way to make it more personal, perhaps. Like that might be an idea. And another one is to sort of maybe allow for open bubbles where people can react to something that's like the idea of what is the truth, really let you open up about some stuff you may have on your mind, even though the question isn't about that. It gives you the space to talk about it. Like, I'm wondering if, for example, a question that it's like, can you mix your skin color? And then maybe underneath, there is like an open field. And the next question is like, what did you think about like that? What did you think about that? Or what do you think about the color you mix? Or some kind of question that gives you the space to expand on that. Or like, what do you think it means? Or like just a way of asking, of giving people space, basically. I think that might be interesting too. That's perhaps like a feasible way of, and an inclusive way of bringing in some of that more subjective experience into the structure of the questionnaire. Yeah, that's a really good idea. Actually, I write that down. Oh, Michael, I see the question. The thoughts on a range answer appearing more important in the results map since it makes up a larger visual space, big rectangle, as opposed to a more specific response, a small square, visually interesting results, revealing someone's actual stance on a subject. Yeah, that was the question of like visual representation in the data is something that has been very tricky, in a sense, like someone who replies with like a big rectangle is more visible than someone who has a tiny rectangle. Part of the things we wanted to program was a way that like the rectangle would be very, very, very transparent. So you would see it much, much less. And then a tiny square will be much more opaque and you would see it more. However, to reach the exact right balance was just costing too much money on time of trying to figure out like an algorithm that would have the right curve. So it's a work in progress. But yeah, I mean, yeah, it like the question of like visual representation of answers is a kind of an ongoing thing.
Also, Nicholas, I was trying to make a little kind of axis there for you to maybe put your response into, which is what those arrows are.
Oh yeah.
Just kind of wondering maybe what's more important to you. I actually went back and saw your last project with the dots. And it was interesting comparing the two and the changes you've made, where your questions kind of got more specific, but then you allowed like a less specific answering system. And I was just wondering like, and you also, I mean, I might be parsing the language too much here, but you said, people told me that they wanted a range, or my thing was too specific. So I didn't know if you were just responding to like feedback, or if that's something that you really wanted. So I was kind of wondering like which one you liked, or if you see flaws in both systems and you're trying to head in another direction.
Yeah, I see flaws in all systems, but it was feedback that I got from some people at first, and I also wanted a range. Also, I think it's part of like an ongoing interest in fuzzy measurements. Like, so there's the idea, for example, of fuzzy sets. So when you go, like a practical example of that is like, if you ask someone like, is this person tall or short? Like the answer may vary a lot from one person to another, but pretty much 100% of people will agree that someone who's 7 feet tall would be tall, and someone who is, say, 4 feet tall would be short. But in between, you may have like a kind of a curve. And so this sort of like the fuzziness in between is what interests me. Like, how do you define like a unit of measurement that is inherently fuzzy? And so I think like the idea for me is with those questionnaires is to sort of think of a way of developing this fuzziness, of allowing the kind of chaos of life to somehow be internalized in the system of it. So I'm not sure that there's a really good system for that, but I think that I'm very interested in scratching that itch further.
Yeah, I guess I was trying to think of, I mean, one is trying to get data, like how much money do you make, or do you see if do you consider yourself rich? But also just kind of someone's like, feelings or emotional or thoughts about maybe a subject that they hadn't really thought of before. And then giving them a range allows them to continue to not think about it very much, as opposed to making them take a stance one way or another. Like I had heard about not having like a middle number if you're asking people's thoughts, like 1 through 5, like, just have 2 in the positive, 2 in the negative, rather, so you can't take a middle stance. You have to choose one or the other. Or for some reason, I'm thinking like when you ask your friend or partner, what do you want for lunch? It's like, I don't know, I'll have anything, right? But then you bring them something and it's like, oh, I had this for lunch yesterday, or I can't eat shellfish, or I'm trying to cut out salt. It's like, once people's initial response might be very open and vague, but then if you, force them kind of like into, or I don't know, set up sort of some manipulations, kind of like what Christy had mentioned earlier, it might be a little less inclusive is the wrong word, but like kind of like open-ending and accommodating, like gray area fuzziness, but you might get more revealing answers about what people actually think and feel.
Yeah, I think like there might be strategies of doing that. Like, for example, ask an open-ended question and then give 5 different ways of measuring the answer. And instead of selecting what you answer, you select the measurement system you want to use. Like for example, with food, if you ask like, what do you want to feel like eating? And then the way of answering the question is not like to select a kind of food, but is to select like, for example, the things you would consider in selecting your food, like whether it's like, say, whether it's, for example, ethical food, or whether it's like reasonably priced, like what would be your criteria to respond to that question? And that would be your answer, for example, as opposed to like, what are the metrics you would choose to answer this question? Could be maybe a way of going in the direction you're suggesting while staying still kind of inclusive. Perhaps I'm trying to do 2 things at once.
Right, like, yeah, I guess.
But like you would basically suggest to like sort of draw a deeper line and ask people like fall on either this side or that side. Is that what you're
I mean, my question was more about what's important to you, because I feel like by choosing one, you're giving up part of the other, or vice versa.
I think I always want both. That's the problem. Like I can't.
And then also the aesthetic. The second part of that chart was also like the aesthetics, like how much that weighs into how you're setting up the questions, and thinking about what the data is going to look like at the end of it, or what. And then also related to that, like, who's the audience going to be for that, or how are you going to then present that back?
I mean, honestly, it's like the first time I did it, I had no clue what it was going to look like, and I never gave it a thought until we had like 1,200 answers, and then it was like, fuck, what do we do? And then, so the second one, I thought about it in advance so that we have these kinds of like rectangles, knowing that it would look different. And then the third one, I'm not sure, like we toyed about with having like a slider of fuzziness. So like you could place a dot and then you could make it fuzzy according to like your answers. That creates an other range of problems in terms of how to represent that. So I guess, I don't know, I'm trying to reveal people's actual stance, but also the kind of, I want to get visually interesting results. So I don't know, I always want both, and it's a problem. I don't know how to deal with that.
Okay, bear with me because I went through this whole like listening to this, and then I went in places. So it would seem that there's like this idea, there's like one approach would be the idea that you could ask neutral questions. And that seems very libertarian to me, that like that like the questions could happen, and then like and then the participants would just like fight it out amongst themselves, whatever that means. And then the opposite of that would be this like highly psychologically manipulative approach of and maybe like liberalism is to believe that what's best for them, and so guiding them through this like very specific psychological way of like taking them through the questions is best. And I'm just like, well, what are the questions like in like an anarchist world that I want, like in a perfect world? And I was like, oh, there aren't any. And so then, sorry, I'm still like a post-COVID cough. Sorry. And so then I was like, well, that's not true. Like, we don't ask each other questions in a perfect world. And I was like, that's not a thing. And then I was like, wait, no, because you would show people your life. Right? Because like
Well,
I would be able to be like, oh, come know me. Like, because like, isn't the goal like human connection? And so instead of telling you what my favorite food is, I would make it for you. I would show you.
mhm.
And so, and then I was like, oh, wow, it's like a show don't tell, like platitude situation, isn't it? And so is there a way for the questions to allow people to show you who they are? And then it was like, yeah, but that's like about human connection. That's only if you want like to have a relationship with people. And then it led me to asking like, how much of a relationship do you want with these people? Because like, there's a way to say like, we've had like a brief exchange and a brief encounter, and then like now it's over, and then we both take something away from that. Or is this like a social practice thing where you do have to consider what your project, like what kind of effect that actually has on the people who participate in it? And I think that is kind of like what social practice really comes down to, is like, social practice should care to some degree about the impact that the work actually has on the participant, and what that relationship, like how long should that relationship last, and what should it look like going forward? Because I'm always so skeptical about things that go into neighborhoods for like a brief period of time and build up. Like there's this Thomas Hirschhorn piece that he did in this play, I think it was like in Brooklyn or someplace like that. He built it was oh my god, an Italian anarchist fucking
Gorshi, something with the G.
Yeah. It was like, so he built this like temporary kind of like community structure, and it was super, super, super meaningful to the community. And they learned a lot about theory because they're already a community that's like entrenched in praxis. And so they learned about community and all of these things. But then it was so temporary, like after the project was over, where is the site? And I guess the hope is that but I just like, I don't know about that, like how long should these relationships even last, and like is that important to you? If it is, how do you change this into a way for the participants to show you their lives?
Yeah, that's I mean, I feel like the main thing might be to not put unrealistic expectations. So to kind of be honest about
Yeah.
that the whole process feels like it's not asking you more than you can give back, or like to have a
Right.
kind of, so I guess that's why for me, like honesty is important in the wording or or in every aspect of how a project gets made. I find personally, I really do think that's a huge challenge of social work in general, like in a sense, like of social practice in particular, just because it can be very extractive, like depending on how it's done. Like I have seen projects go well and others go less well. And I mean, I remember having those discussions with people who, after a project of being invested in the community for say a year, were just like, fuck, actually, I'm not sure if a painting doesn't do more for a community than asking everybody to give their time and energy to participate in something that then disappears without having made any change. And sometimes people just argue with each other and just become enemies or something. It's hard. It's super hard. I mean, personally, I'm not enough invested in social practice per se. So, and also as a person, I have a difficulty to like not keep a bit of a distance with people. Like I'm always a bit more seclusive. So I think the project, maybe that's the formalism, you know, like there's an aspect of me that just creates a little step back. It's a really good question. Honestly, I don't know how to do that well. I think like that's maybe like one of the great difficulties with projects that try to like get to know people is like, how do you give back? Or how do you meet on equal ground, right? Like I find it super hard.
I've done it by just making everything a franchise that they take over on their own and they make it their own, and then it's their own. It's like it's about an idea and not really an authorship, and then for the stuff that's social, you know.
Right.
Yeah, because I think that it's like there's no everything else feels like a cult. Everything else feels like I believe in this thing, we believe in this thing, I'm your leader now, and we're believing together. Like, so I think everything, like making every idea a franchise that somebody else can make their own. And then you are a networked idea, but there's so many different manifestations of it.
I mean, I agree. I just feel that like personally, I have tried somehow, but I find it like it just doesn't fit my personality. Like I'm someone who will obsessively toy with one thing forever and then be like presented as something. So I do unfortunately fit more in the kind of annoying traditional category of the person who makes a thing and then does something with it. And to my great annoyance, I have tried to work in other ways. And I do work collectively with other projects, but I find that I have a tendency to just feel more like myself if I do something. So I guess I try to compensate by being generous in the making of things and to not do too many. And then if I release something, if it's like any project, that at least it feels like you're not wasting your time to engage with it. Like I also gave so much of myself in the thing that like, if I ask you to engage with it, hopefully you will find something in it that's worth your time. I guess that's maybe how I deal with it presently, but it's not ideal either.
When I was in grad school, I had like a terrible ex-boyfriend who was a year ahead of me in the program. And I asked him what he thought of this big installation I had made. And he was like, I feel like you're asking me to think about it more than you did. And it was so grateful because I was like, oh shit, I think I just learned the definition of bad art. I think that might be it. I think that just might be it. Like, you're right. I didn't really think about it. I was kind of hoping you would.
That's certainly a lot of that art. I'm not sure if it's all of it, but it's certainly a lot of it.
Yeah. I also want to say that I think like formalism is super poetic, by the way. Like I think that like if you can talk about the way that the line meanders throughout the space, bringing the viewer's eye to a fluttering place, throughout the composition, moving, flowing like a river, how is that not poetry? Like I like think formalism is very poetic, by the way. Like the way that you described it, kind of like moving on to like bigger questions of shape and form.
I guess for me, it's just like my idea of formalism is still one that is linked to a certain kind of pretension to hierarchy, saying like this is above and superior to the rest, which is why I don't like the idea of formalism. But at the same time, I like a lot of things within formalism. I just don't like the kind of superiority that's sort of that it ascribes to itself often. Yeah.
Guys, I'm gonna interrupt us. It's 3:45 or almost 45. Oh, I'm in Miami. And I've been taking over my brother's living room, so I feel like I have to cut out, but you all are welcome to stay, I think. I'll leave my screen open. But really quick, did everybody get my 2 emails? Did everyone get 2 emails?
I'm not sure which were the 2.
They were the same email.
Oh yeah, okay, then I did.
Different email addresses. The first one I sent and it didn't send. I couldn't figure out why. I just didn't get it in my inbox. Oh, bye, Cedric. But I guess it worked. It delayed. It like sent out an hour later or something. Okay, so we're gonna use the Gmail one moving forward so that other people can email, which we're still figuring that out. But Yeah.
Bye.
Bye. I also have to go. Thank you everyone so much for your feedback. It's super, super appreciated. And I guess I'll see you next month. And Christy, I'm super down to discuss the sound thing. I'll send you
Yeah,
an
yeah,
email.
I'm excited because I see like connections, and I feel like I don't actually have time right now to take on like a whole project, but I bet half of one.
That sounds good. That sounds
Yeah.
good. I'll
Cool.
drop you an email next week.
Okay, great, perfect.
Cool. To everyone.
And if anybody wants to present next month, let me know, or you can sign up in the shared folder. There's a sign up sheet. And if not, then I'm gonna ask. I have a couple artists in mind. I'm gonna ask.
I could do it. I could do
Okay.
like stuff